Look at a map of southern Vermont, and you'll see nothing out of the ordinary. But maps lie, because beneath the quiet ridges and the thick, suffocating forests of Glastenbury Mountain lies a secret that has been waiting in the shadows for generations. Before the headlines, before the chaos, and before the disappearances, the land itself was already keeping a dark, unspoken history. And tonight, we're going to walk that path. If you are watching this right now, I want to ask you something. What really happened? Because every case you are about to hear has one thing in common. The investigation was closed, the file was sealed, and the truth was never found. These are the cases that detectives couldn't solve, that witnesses couldn't explain, and that official records couldn't account for. If you are someone who needs to know what really happened, you are in the right place. Subscribe to Unsolved Vault and join thousands of investigators uncovering the case's history left unfinished. Welcome back. This is Unsolved Vault. And today, we open a case that was never meant to stay closed. Southern Vermont holds a stretch of land that appears ordinary on a map, yet its shape feels strangely isolated when viewed more closely. Thick forests rise between uneven ridges, while narrow valleys cut quiet paths through the landscape. Old roads drift toward forgotten corners and disappear into heavy woods. Near the center stands Glastenbury Mountain, watching over a region that later gained a curious name. Long before stories of missing people emerged, this section of Vermont carried a geography that seemed distant from the rest of the world. Stepping into those woods brings an experience that changes with every season. Pine needles soften the ground beneath each footstep, and cold streams hide beneath blankets of stone and moss. Wind slips through the trees with a low whisper that often sounds farther away than it truly is. In autumn, fallen leaves cover old paths and blur the edges between familiar places and unknown spaces. Even the air carries a different feeling there, touched by damp earth and the faint scent of aging timber. As decades passed, the region quietly transformed around the edges. Logging camps appeared and disappeared. Rail lines reached into the mountains before retreating again. Families settled in scattered valleys, then gradually moved away when industries changed and opportunities faded elsewhere. Trails that once carried workers and travelers slowly became harder to follow. Small communities shifted with time, leaving behind traces rather than clear memories. By the early 20th century, pieces of the landscape already held the atmosphere of something partially forgotten. People who lived nearby often spoke about the area with an unusual mixture of familiarity and distance. They knew the mountains well, yet many described certain sections with careful respect. There was no single story that explained those feelings. Instead, impressions passed quietly between generations. A bend in the road, a shadowed valley, or a stretch of woods could carry meaning that outsiders rarely understood. Looking back now, it feels as though the land itself was gathering stories long before anyone thought to give them a name. Long before the phrase Bennington Triangle entered newspapers and books, southern Vermont existed as a place shaped by distance. The mountains created natural barriers that separated one valley from another. Roads wound around steep ridges rather than cutting directly through them. In winter, snow could isolate entire communities for days. Even in warmer months, travelers sometimes discovered that places appearing close on paper demanded hours of difficult movement. The land encouraged patience. It asked people to respect its boundaries rather than challenge them. The region surrounding Glastenbury Mountain developed slowly because nature offered few easy advantages. Small settlements appeared where streams provided water and forests supplied timber. Houses stood far apart. Stores and churches served families scattered across wide stretches of countryside. Neighbors often knew each other through necessity rather than convenience. Life depended on weather, hard labor, and the changing seasons. While larger towns expanded elsewhere, these mountain communities remained modest. Their isolation became part of daily life, accepted without much discussion because few people expected anything different. During the 19th century, hopes for prosperity reached the mountains. Logging companies arrived with plans that promised growth. Railroads pushed deeper into the forests. Workers built camps and temporary settlements close to valuable timber. For a while, the mountains echoed with saws, steam engines, and the sounds of men earning their living among the trees. New buildings appeared where only wilderness had stood before. Some believed these remote valleys would become lasting centers of industry. Yet the promise proved fragile, tied closely to resources that could not renew themselves quickly. As the forests changed, so did the fortunes of the communities built around them. Trees disappeared from hillsides, and companies shifted their attention elsewhere when profits declined. Rail lines that once carried supplies and workers became less important. Businesses closed. Families packed their belongings and searched for opportunities beyond the mountains. Houses stood empty. Shops locked their doors. Nature slowly reclaimed places that had briefly resisted its presence. Grass covered forgotten foundations, and trees returned to spaces where people once gathered. By the early 20th century, much of the region carried a strange balance between memory and absence. Visitors passing through could still find signs of earlier ambitions. Weathered structures leaned against the passing years. Faint traces of roads disappeared beneath brush and fallen leaves. Some locals remembered communities that younger generations barely recognized by name. Stories about former residents survived around kitchen tables and general stores. Yet the landscape itself revealed little. It held fragments rather than explanations, as though entire chapters had quietly slipped beneath the surface of the forest. Maps of southern Vermont offered clear lines and familiar names, yet they often concealed the true character of the terrain. A valley that seemed gentle from a distance could suddenly narrow into rough ground. Hills rolled into thicker forests where visibility faded after only a few yards. Streams changed direction without warning. Even experienced residents understood that the land could be deceptive. Knowing the names of roads and mountains was one thing. Understanding how they behaved through changing seasons was something entirely different. Weather added another layer to that uncertainty. Morning sunlight could fill the valleys with warmth, only to surrender to heavy fog before midday. Rain drifted across the mountains with little warning. Clouds settled low against the ridges and erased distant landmarks. During autumn, colorful leaves covered rocks, roots, and old paths beneath bright blankets that appeared harmless. Winter brought snow that softened familiar shapes and concealed streams beneath smooth white surfaces. Conditions rarely stayed fixed for long. The mountains carried their own moods, and those moods could shift without explanation. Animals moved through the region in ways that reminded people they shared the landscape rather than controlled it. Deer crossed narrow trails in silence. Black bears wandered between wooded slopes searching for food. Coyotes announced themselves through distant calls that drifted across the valleys after sunset. Hawks circled high above clearings where abandoned farms had once stood. Residents accepted these sights as ordinary parts of life. Yet the presence of wildlife also reinforced an older truth. Human settlements occupied only small pieces of a much larger world. For travelers arriving from busy towns, the atmosphere often produced unexpected reactions. Some spoke about the quiet. Others noticed how quickly darkness arrived beneath the trees. Distances felt different there. Sounds carried strangely across valleys and disappeared just as suddenly. A person could stand beside a stream and hear nothing beyond moving water and rustling leaves. Such moments brought calm to some visitors. For others, the silence inspired unease they struggled to explain. It was not fear exactly. It was the sensation of entering a place that paid little attention to human concerns. By the 1940s, much of the region remained sparsely populated despite changes happening across the country. Cities expanded. Roads improved elsewhere. Technology connected communities in new ways. Yet around Glastenbury Mountain, older rhythms persisted. Empty stretches of forest-separated villages. Forgotten railbeds rested beneath layers of earth and moss. Travelers passing through often saw beauty in the mountains, but long-time residents recognized something deeper. They understood that the landscape had preserved pieces of the past, and in doing so, it had created a setting where mysteries could easily take root. The people who remained in southern Vermont developed routines shaped by the mountains around them. Farmers rose before daylight and measured their days through weather rather than clocks. Hunters disappeared into the woods for hours with little concern. Children walked long distances to school, crossing roads that curved through valleys and over streams. Mail carriers and delivery drivers memorized routes that outsiders found confusing. These habits created confidence. Familiar paths became trusted companions, and many residents believed the land revealed itself best to those who moved through it slowly. Conversations in small towns carried a rhythm of their own. News traveled through diners, post offices, and general stores before it appeared anywhere else. Residents exchanged stories about road conditions, changing seasons, and families living beyond the next ridge. Older people remembered names connected to places that no longer appeared on modern maps. A hill might carry the memory of a sawmill. A clearing might once have held a farmhouse long since vanished. These details lived inside conversations rather than books. The landscape and its history stayed connected through ordinary voices. Visitors occasionally noticed that locals gave directions differently. Instead of measuring distance in miles, they pointed toward landmarks and memories. Someone might mention an abandoned bridge, an old cemetery, or the remains of a railway bed hidden beneath trees. Such references revealed how deeply people associated places with stories. Certain roads carried reputations built through years of experience. Some paths were recommended. Others inspired brief pauses before answers came. Nobody spoke dramatically. Yet subtle expressions and quiet hesitations suggested that not every corner of the region held the same meaning. Life after sunset brought another character to the mountains. Porch lights glowed against long stretches of darkness. Radios played softly inside kitchens while cold air settled over the valleys. In isolated homes, families gathered around wood stoves and shared stories that blended memory with local tradition. Outside, distant animal calls echoed through the forests. Headlights passing along country roads became rare sights. Night encouraged reflection because distractions were few. In that environment, old tales survived naturally. They passed from one generation to another without ceremony, woven into ordinary evenings. Among those stories were small observations that resisted easy explanation. Hunters sometimes spoke about losing their sense of direction in familiar areas. Travelers mentioned unusual feelings that arrived without warning and faded just as quickly. Others described moments when sounds behaved strangely among the ridges. Most people treated such accounts with quiet acceptance rather than excitement. They were pieces of local experience, neither celebrated nor dismissed. Looking back now, these fragments feel important. They reveal that the strange reputation surrounding the Bennington Triangle did not appear overnight. It grew slowly from countless ordinary lives shaped by the wilderness. By the middle of the 20th century, the mountains surrounding Bennington carried two identities at once. To many people, they represented beauty and familiarity. Visitors admired the changing colors of autumn and the peaceful valleys hidden among the ridges. Artists and travelers found comfort in the quiet landscapes. Yet beneath that image existed another understanding, known mostly by those who had spent years among the forests. They understood that the mountains demanded respect. Their beauty could be welcoming, but their distances and hidden spaces encouraged caution. Glastenbury Mountain stood near the center of this uneasy relationship between people and the land. Its slopes had witnessed changing industries, disappearing communities, and generations of residents who came and went. Abandoned rail grades and forgotten roads remained scattered beneath layers of leaves and moss. The mountain itself offered no explanation for the memories attached to it. It simply occupied its place above the valleys, unchanged by the ambitions that had risen around it. Human lives passed beneath its shadow, while the landscape quietly preserved traces of each passing era. Old maps from the region tell stories that modern roads often conceal. Names appear for settlements that no longer exist. Small communities once connected by railroads slowly faded from memory after businesses closed and residents moved away. Some locations survived only through photographs and family recollections. Others disappeared so completely that travelers crossed their former sites without realizing it. Forests covered foundations. Streams altered familiar boundaries. Time softened the marks left behind. The wilderness became a keeper of forgotten chapters, holding details that few people paused to notice. Perhaps that is what gave the region its unusual atmosphere long before the mysteries arrived. The mountains carried echoes rather than answers. Every abandoned trail hinted at footsteps that belonged to another century. Every weathered stone wall suggested lives that had unfolded far from modern attention. Residents accepted these reminders because they formed part of the landscape they knew. Outsiders sensed something different without always understanding why. The feeling came not from one place or one story, but from layers of memory hidden beneath ordinary surroundings. Years later, when disappearances began to capture headlines and strange theories entered public conversation, people searched for explanations inside the forests. But the shape of the Bennington Triangle had already existed long before fear attached itself to the name. The empty valleys, forgotten roads, and silent mountains had spent generations collecting histories that few outsiders understood. In many ways, the mystery started with the landscape itself. Before vanished people, before newspaper reports, before legends, there was simply a wilderness that seemed to keep certain things to itself, and a quiet feeling that not every secret wished to be found. But how did a place once filled with life, with homes, laughter, and the steady rhythm of industry, turn into a silent graveyard of history? To understand the mystery, we first have to see what the forest worked so hard to bury. Let's head back to when the silence first began. Hidden beneath the forests surrounding Glastenbury Mountain are traces of communities that once carried ordinary lives. Stone foundations sit beneath layers of moss, and broken walls emerge quietly between clusters of maple and pine. Narrow clearings interrupt the woods in unexpected places, marking where farms and homes once stood. Old wells remain buried beneath leaves, while forgotten roads appear only as faint lines cutting through the undergrowth. Looking across the landscape today, it is difficult to imagine that these silent places once held families, businesses, and busy routines. Walking through those forgotten spaces creates a strange experience that differs from the rest of the mountains. Damp earth releases the scent of wet wood and decaying leaves. Birds move through the branches above, while distant streams create soft echoes beneath the trees. Sometimes the remains of stacked stones appear without warning, giving the feeling that someone had only recently stepped away. The sounds of modern life seem far away. Instead, the woods offer subtle reminders that people once filled these places with voices and familiar activity. Time changed these settlements gradually rather than all at once. Logging industries faded, rail connections weakened, and younger generations sought opportunities elsewhere. Houses emptied one by one. Stores closed their doors, and farms that had survived harsh winters slowly disappeared beneath returning forests. Seasons continued their work across abandoned land. Grass covered old paths, saplings grew beside weathered foundations, and streams reshaped forgotten boundaries. Decades passed quietly, and the wilderness reclaimed places that had briefly belonged to people who believed their communities would endure. There is something deeply curious about landscapes that preserve evidence while withholding stories. Looking at a collapsed cellar or a row of broken stones invites questions that rarely receive complete answers. Names disappear, memories fade, and entire communities shrink into small details hidden beneath trees. Yet those traces carry a quiet weight. They suggest lives filled with ordinary hopes and familiar routines. Long before the Bennington Triangle became known for disappearances, these mountains had already learned how to hide pieces of the past beneath layers of earth and memory. During the 19th century, small settlements began appearing across the remote valleys surrounding Glastenbury Mountain. Families arrived with practical goals and strong expectations. Timber promised employment, streams provided power, and narrow rail lines offered connections to larger towns. Houses rose beside rough roads, and simple churches became gathering places for scattered communities. General stores supplied necessities while schools welcomed children whose families hoped to build lasting lives. These villages were never large, but they possessed a quiet confidence. People believed the mountains could support generations yet to come. Among those communities was Glastenbury itself, a town that existed more on effort than convenience. Logging operations gave residents a reason to remain. Workers spent long days cutting timber and transporting supplies through demanding terrain. Boarding houses welcomed laborers, and merchants depended upon the steady movement of goods. In the evenings, families gathered inside modest homes while smoke drifted from chimneys into the cold Vermont air. Life demanded persistence, but neighbors knew one another well. Shared work and common hardships created bonds that gave meaning to everyday routines. The railroad changed everything for a time. Tracks pushed deeper into the wilderness and connected isolated settlements to distant markets. Trains carried lumber, passengers, and supplies across landscapes that had once been difficult to reach. Communities expanded around these routes, believing growth would continue. New buildings appeared. Businesses opened. Residents spoke about the future with confidence. Yet prosperity rested upon resources that were never endless. As forests thinned and industries shifted elsewhere, the same railroads that had encouraged growth began carrying people away from the mountains instead. Leaving rarely happened in dramatic waves. Families moved when opportunities appeared elsewhere. Young people sought employment beyond the valleys. Stores struggled as populations declined. Schools closed when too few children remained. Empty houses stood through harsh winters, waiting for owners who never returned. One departure led quietly to another. Eventually, entire communities found themselves balanced between memory and disappearance. Roads remained, but fewer travelers used them. Chimneys stood without smoke. Buildings weathered under snow and rain, watched only by forests slowly moving closer each year. Nature showed remarkable patience during this transition. Trees grew through abandoned clearings. Moss spread across stone walls that once marked property lines. Streams carried leaves past broken foundations where kitchens and bedrooms had once stood. Seasons repeated their quiet work without concern for human ambitions. Decades later, many former settlements became difficult to recognize. Visitors sometimes walked through these places without realizing what lay beneath their feet. Yet hidden among roots and shadows were reminders that people had laughed, argued, worked, and dreamed there. The mountains had not erased those communities entirely. They had folded them gently into the wilderness. Finding the remains of these forgotten villages often happens by accident. A hiker following an old trail might notice a line of stones where no natural formation should exist. A hunter moving through thick brush may come across rusted metal hidden beneath ferns. Sometimes a shallow depression in the ground reveals the outline of a cellar where a family once lived. Nothing announces these discoveries. The forest offers them quietly, almost as passing details. Yet each object carries evidence that entire communities once occupied spaces now claimed by trees and shadows. Among the most curious remnants are the cemeteries scattered across the region. Small burial grounds lie beneath tall maples and weathered pines, their stones worn smooth by rain and frost. Names that were once familiar have become difficult to read. Some markers lean at strange angles. Others have fallen beneath layers of leaves and moss. A few belong to children who lived only briefly. Standing among these graves creates a strange awareness. Entire generations remain present through these simple stones, even though the communities around them disappeared long ago. Old photographs provide another glimpse into these vanished worlds. Images preserved by local families show houses standing proudly beside dirt roads. School children gather outside wooden buildings, dressed carefully for the camera. Men pose near logging equipment while women stand on porches that no longer exist. Looking at these photographs creates an unusual contrast. The people appear confident and ordinary, unaware that future generations would struggle to locate the places they called home. Their expressions reveal no hint that the forests would one day surround and conceal their communities. Local historians and residents have spent years searching for traces hidden beneath the wilderness. Some study maps and records. Others walk forgotten railbeds and overgrown roads. Their efforts have uncovered foundations, tools, household objects, and stories passed down through families. These discoveries rarely answer every question. Instead, they reveal fragments that must be carefully connected. A rusted stove, a broken bottle, or a section of stone wall becomes part of a larger picture. Through these small details, lives that seemed lost begin to emerge once again from beneath the trees. What makes these places particularly haunting is not destruction, but absence. Nothing dramatic marks their disappearance. There are no ruins towering above the forest. Instead, there are hints and suggestions. A clearing where sunlight falls differently. A cluster of lilacs growing far from any modern home. A stone staircase leading nowhere. These quiet signs create a feeling that history has settled just beneath the surface. They remind visitors that entire communities can fade from view while leaving behind only whispers for those willing to notice them. For the people who remained in neighboring towns, the abandoned villages never completely disappeared from memory. Older residents spoke about them in ordinary conversations, mentioning family names and places that younger generations rarely recognized. Directions often included landmarks that no longer appeared on modern maps. Someone might refer to an old mill, a vanished schoolhouse, or a road that had long since surrendered to the forest. These memories survived through voices rather than official records. In many ways, the stories became a bridge between the living communities and those that had quietly slipped away. Hunters and woodsmen sometimes passed through these forgotten areas without giving them much thought. To them, old foundations and broken walls were familiar sights. They knew where abandoned roads curved beneath the trees and which valleys once supported small settlements. Some had heard stories from parents and grandparents who remembered the final years of those communities. Others discovered remnants while exploring remote sections of the mountains. Their relationship with these places was practical rather than mysterious. Yet even experienced men occasionally paused when unexpected traces emerged from the undergrowth. Visitors often reacted differently. People unfamiliar with the region noticed details that locals accepted without much attention. A chimney standing alone among trees could create a sense of curiosity. A row of stone walls stretching through dense woods raised questions about who had placed them there. Some travelers described feeling as though they had entered spaces abandoned only recently, despite knowing decades had passed. The contrast between nature and human history created an atmosphere that seemed difficult to explain. It was not fear that people described. It was a strange awareness that life had once occupied these hidden corners. Children growing up near the mountains encountered these stories through family traditions rather than books. Grandparents spoke about places they remembered from their youth. Old photographs appeared during gatherings, bringing forgotten names back into conversation. Certain roads carried memories attached to specific families. Cemeteries hidden among the trees became destinations during quiet visits. Through these habits, the vanished villages continued to occupy a place within everyday life. Their physical presence had faded, but their connections to living memories remained surprisingly strong. Over time, these fragments of history blended naturally into the identity of the region. People accepted that the mountains contained more than forests and streams. Beneath the leaves rested evidence of lives that had unfolded with ordinary hopes and familiar struggles. Long before newspapers and mysteries brought national attention to the Bennington Triangle, the land already held stories marked by disappearance. Not vanished people, but vanished communities. Entire neighborhoods had drifted into memory while the wilderness patiently gathered their remains beneath branches, moss, and quiet shadows. Looking across the Bennington region today, it is easy to focus on the forests and mountains and imagine that the wilderness has always appeared this way. Yet beneath those layers of green lie forgotten neighborhoods, roads, and farms that once formed small but determined communities. Their disappearance happened so gradually that few people noticed the transformation while it unfolded. One generation replaced another. Families moved away. Buildings collapsed. Seasons continued their endless work. By the time outsiders arrived, much of the evidence had already been absorbed into the landscape. Glastenbury became one of the most remarkable examples of this quiet retreat. Once recognized as an official town, it slowly lost the population needed to sustain itself. Railroads faded. Industries declined. The reasons were practical, yet the result carried an almost dreamlike quality. A place that had once appeared on maps and supported ordinary lives drifted toward emptiness. Eventually, the town ceased functioning in the traditional sense. What remained were scattered traces and memories preserved by a handful of records and stories passed between generations. Perhaps that is why these abandoned settlements continue to inspire such fascination. They reveal how fragile human presence can be. Families who planted gardens and built homes believed they were creating permanent lives. Children played beside streams and attended schools that no longer exist. Workers followed routines that seemed certain to continue. Yet time carried those familiar patterns away with surprising ease. Looking at the surviving foundations, one realizes how quickly ordinary lives can become hidden chapters. The silence surrounding these places feels less like destruction and more like distance. The forests themselves became unexpected caretakers of these memories. Roots wrapped around forgotten stone walls. Trees rose through clearings where livestock once grazed. Wildflowers appeared beside abandoned wells and broken foundations. Nature did not erase the past with violence. Instead, it covered it gently, allowing fragments to remain for those willing to look closely. A traveler might pass through these valleys without noticing anything unusual. Yet beneath leaves and moss rests a quiet archive shaped by lives that once seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves. Long before the stories of missing people transformed the Bennington Triangle into one of America's most unsettling mysteries, another kind of disappearance had already taken place. Entire communities had faded beneath the trees. Their names survived in records, photographs, and fading memories, but their presence belonged to another age. In many ways, these ghost villages became the first secrets hidden within the mountains. They remind us that the wilderness around Glastenbury learned how to conceal things long before anyone began asking darker questions about what else might have been lost among the shadows. We see the remnants of houses and the broken stone walls. But there's something else, a deeper, unsettling layer. Even the people who built their lives here, who knew these woods like the back of their hands, started speaking in hushed tones. Why did the mountain change from a home into something people learned to fear? Rising above the forests of southern Vermont, Glastenbury Mountain presents a rugged shape marked by steep slopes and deep stretches of woodland. Dense trees cover much of its surface, while narrow streams cut through rocky ground hidden beneath layers of moss and fallen leaves. Old paths appear and disappear among the ridges, and mist often settles across the higher elevations. From a distance, the mountain seems ordinary enough. Yet people who lived nearby often regarded certain sections with unusual caution, giving the landscape a character unlike the surrounding valleys. Those who ventured near the mountain sometimes described experiences that stayed with them long after returning home. The air felt cooler beneath the trees, and sounds behaved strangely among the ridges. Wind moved through the forest with low echoes that seemed difficult to place. Fog drifted unexpectedly across familiar trails, softening shapes and blurring distances. Travelers noticed how quickly ordinary noises disappeared beneath the canopy. In quiet moments, even simple footsteps could sound unfamiliar. Such details left impressions that were difficult to explain, though many remembered them clearly. Over generations, attitudes toward Glastenbury Mountain changed in subtle ways. Native traditions and local beliefs passed quietly from one group to another. Certain areas gained reputations that encouraged people to tread carefully. Hunters shared observations. Families repeated stories heard from older relatives. Warnings rarely appeared dramatic, yet they survived because enough people treated them seriously. Newcomers arriving in the region encountered these ideas through conversations rather than written records. Gradually, the mountain acquired an identity shaped not by a single event, but by years of shared experiences and cautious respect. Looking back, what stands out most is not fear, but curiosity wrapped inside memory. The mountain inspired questions that few people expected to answer completely. Stories changed with each generation, yet something beneath them remained difficult to ignore. People spoke quietly because they felt they were preserving impressions rather than facts. Perhaps that is why Glastenbury Mountain occupied such an unusual place within local history. Long before disappearances and headlines drew wider attention, the mountain had already become a place where certainty felt strangely out of reach. Long before European settlers arrived in the valleys of southern Vermont, the land surrounding Glastenbury Mountain held meaning for native communities who traveled through the region. Oral traditions preserved observations about certain places that demanded caution and respect. The mountain itself was not always viewed as a destination. Instead, some stories suggested that particular areas were better crossed than occupied. These beliefs were not built upon fear alone. They reflected generations of experience passed through memory, where landscapes carried lessons gathered over centuries rather than written instructions. Among later residents, fragments of those traditions survived in altered forms. Details changed as stories moved between cultures, yet the central idea remained surprisingly consistent. People often spoke of places where something felt unusual. Hunters described sections of forest that seemed strangely difficult to navigate. Travelers occasionally mentioned sudden feelings of unease without understanding why. None of these accounts offered clear explanations. Instead, they created an atmosphere where caution became part of local knowledge. The mountain earned respect not because of a single event, but because many voices carried similar impressions. Early settlers brought their own beliefs and superstitions into the wilderness. Life in remote Vermont demanded attention to things that city dwellers rarely considered. Weather shifted quickly. Dense forests altered familiar landmarks. Strange sounds echoed through valleys after dark. In isolated communities, stories became part of daily life. Families gathered around fireplaces and exchanged accounts heard from neighbors and relatives. Some tales involved lost hunters. Others focused on unusual lights or unexplained noises among the trees. Whether true or exaggerated, these stories shaped how people viewed the mountain. What made such accounts remarkable was their quiet nature. There were no public campaigns warning people away. Newspapers rarely mentioned anything unusual. Instead, caution passed through ordinary conversations. Someone might pause before mentioning a particular trail. Another person would advise avoiding certain ridges during poor weather. Older residents sometimes offered warnings without explaining their reasons fully. Their words carried the tone of experience rather than imagination. Because these exchanges happened naturally, they became woven into local traditions without attracting much attention from outsiders. As years passed, these scattered beliefs settled into the character of the region itself. New generations inherited stories whose origins had become difficult to trace. People remembered the warnings, even when they no longer remembered who first spoke them. A mountain, after all, cannot explain the impressions attached to it. It simply stands above the forests while human memories gather around its slopes. Looking back now, those early stories seem less like legends and more like echoes. They reveal that Glastenbury Mountain possessed an uneasy reputation long before anyone thought to call the area the Bennington Triangle. Many of the stories surrounding Glastenbury Mountain survived because they changed with the people who carried them. A hunter might tell one version around a campfire, while a farmer repeated another during winter evenings at home. Details shifted over time, but certain themes continued to appear. People spoke about unusual feelings that arrived without warning. Others mentioned moments when familiar paths seemed confusing. Some remembered hearing sounds they could not identify. These accounts rarely became dramatic tales. Instead, they lingered quietly inside conversations, passed along with the same care given to family memories. One story that appeared again and again involved the strange behavior of sound. Residents noticed that voices sometimes carried farther than expected, while other noises disappeared unexpectedly among the ridges. A distant call could seem nearby. Flowing water might mask footsteps. Wind moving between valleys created echoes that confused even experienced woodsmen. Such experiences had practical explanations, yet people remembered them because they felt unusual. Over time, these details became part of the mountain's reputation. Visitors often dismissed them, but longtime residents recognized the descriptions immediately. Another belief centered around the feeling of direction itself. Woodsmen who knew the area well occasionally admitted that certain sections of the mountain created moments of uncertainty. Familiar landmarks appeared different beneath fog or changing light. Trails crossed old logging roads and animal paths that could mislead travelers. Even skilled hunters sometimes found themselves stopping to reorient their surroundings. These moments rarely ended in disaster, but they left lasting impressions. Stories about losing one's bearings traveled through communities because they reflected experiences shared by people known for their knowledge of the land. Not every account involved danger. Some spoke of strange lights seen from distant valleys or unexpected changes in weather around the slopes. Others remembered sudden pockets of silence where birdsong seemed absent for brief moments. Such observations encouraged speculation, though few people claimed to understand them. Residents accepted that mountains possessed their own character. Weather, terrain, and isolation shaped experiences in ways that outsiders sometimes overlooked. Rather than searching for extraordinary explanations, many people simply accepted that certain places felt different from others. By the early 20th century, Glastenbury Mountain had become more than a physical location. It had developed a reputation built through countless small observations. No single story created that reputation. Instead, it emerged through generations of voices speaking quietly about familiar experiences. The mountain occupied an unusual space between ordinary geography and local memory. Looking back now, those stories feel less like warnings and more like pieces of a puzzle. They suggest that people sensed something unusual long before later mysteries brought national attention to the region. By the early decades of the 20th century, the people living near Glastenbury Mountain had developed habits shaped by old advice. Hunters prepared carefully before entering remote areas. Farmers finishing work before sunset often preferred familiar roads over isolated shortcuts. Travelers heading into the mountains shared their plans with neighbors and family members. These customs were not unusual for rural communities, yet they reflected a deeper awareness of the landscape. Experience had taught residents that the forests demanded attention, and caution became part of everyday life rather than something spoken about openly. Conversations in local stores and homes revealed how these attitudes were passed between generations. Older men rarely lectured younger people about the mountain. Instead, they offered brief observations that carried quiet authority. Someone might suggest avoiding certain ridges during heavy fog. Another person would mention how weather changed quickly near the higher slopes. Advice often arrived casually, wrapped inside ordinary discussions about hunting, logging, or seasonal work. Because these warnings appeared naturally, they settled into memory without attracting much notice from those hearing them. Visitors sometimes misunderstood the attitudes they encountered. Outsiders expected dramatic legends or frightening stories, but local residents usually spoke with restraint. They did not describe monsters or supernatural dangers. Their words carried something more subtle. They respected the mountain because they knew its moods. They had seen storms appear unexpectedly and watched thick fog erase familiar landmarks. To them, caution represented practical wisdom rather than fear. Yet people unfamiliar with the region occasionally sensed something unusual beneath those conversations, as though certain thoughts remained unspoken. Season after season, these patterns repeated themselves. Hunting parties returned with stories about weather, wildlife, and changing conditions. Families gathered during winter evenings and exchanged memories connected to old trails and forgotten settlements. Children listened to these conversations long before they fully understood them. Years later, they found themselves repeating the same advice to younger relatives. Through this quiet cycle, impressions surrounding the mountain survived. They became traditions built through repetition rather than formal teaching. No one needed to preserve them deliberately because they remained woven into ordinary life. Looking back now, what makes these traditions remarkable is their simplicity. There were no grand warnings carved into stone. No official records instructed people to stay away. Instead, there existed countless small moments shaped by memory and experience. A pause before mentioning a trail. A brief caution offered before a hunting trip. A story remembered during a winter evening. Piece by piece, these ordinary exchanges gave Glastenbury Mountain an identity unlike any other place in the region. Long before mysteries captured headlines, the mountain had already earned the careful respect of those who knew it best. As decades passed, many of the older voices that carried these stories gradually disappeared. Families moved away, industries changed, and younger generations became more connected to the outside world. Yet the impressions surrounding Glastenbury Mountain never vanished entirely. They survived through memories that seemed too familiar to dismiss. A grandfather remembered advice given by his father. A hunter recalled warnings shared by an older companion. These fragments remained scattered across time. No one person held the entire story, but together they formed something larger than any individual account. Historians examining the region later discovered how difficult it was to separate fact from tradition. Written records preserved only a small portion of what local residents remembered. Most of the stories had traveled through conversations rather than documents. Native beliefs, settler experiences, and personal observations became intertwined over generations. Details changed as memories passed from one voice to another. Yet a curious pattern emerged beneath those differences. People from different periods and backgrounds often described similar feelings about the mountain. That quiet consistency became impossible to ignore completely. Perhaps this is what gave Glastenbury Mountain its unusual place within local history. The mystery surrounding it developed slowly, almost unnoticed. There was no single event that transformed the mountain into something extraordinary. Instead, years of ordinary experiences accumulated beneath the surface. Strange sounds, confusing weather, uneasy feelings, and cautious traditions blended together over time. None of these things proved anything by themselves. Yet together they created an atmosphere that encouraged curiosity. The mountain became a place where questions seemed easier to collect than answers. When newspapers eventually began reporting disappearances connected to the region, many outsiders viewed the stories as something entirely new. But residents who had lived near the mountain understood that the uneasy reputation had existed long before the headlines arrived. They remembered old conversations and warnings passed down through generations. To them, the mysteries were entering a landscape already shaped by memory. The mountain had carried stories for decades. Public attention simply introduced those stories to people who had never heard them before. Today, Glastenbury Mountain stands much as it always has above the forests of southern Vermont. Visitors arrive searching for explanations, while historians continue examining records and traditions left behind by earlier generations. Yet perhaps the most intriguing detail lies not in what people claim to know, but in what they quietly accepted. Long before vanished hikers and newspaper headlines brought fame to the Bennington Triangle, the mountain had already become a place surrounded by careful words and lingering questions. In that sense, the mystery began not with disappearances, but with memories that refused to fade. The locals kept their secrets well. They knew the mountain had a mood, a shifting, deceptive pulse that defied logic. But eventually, the silence broke. The patterns of the past were about to collide with a series of events that would shock the world. We've only just scratched the surface of what hides in these woods. Make sure you are ready, because the full, chilling reality of the Bennington Triangle is unfolding. I'll see you back here, in just 48 hours.